So today, The Relevant Past of Palestine is the title of our first minisode on Palestine, its past, present, and future. One of the main battles of narratives around the events of the 7th of October 2023 evolves around the question of historical context. The Israeli and pro-Israeli position or interpretation of the Hamas's operation on the 7th of October 2023 is very clear. According to that perspective, the Israeli and pro-Israeli perspective, the attack of the Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October and everything that unfolded after that attack have nothing to do with the history of Israel and Palestine, but are the result of what Israel calls the new Islamic anti-Semitism, the epicenter of which is the Islamic Republic of Iran that uses proxies like the Hamas to fulfill the ultimate goal of the old and new anti-Semitism, namely the mass killing of Jews just because they are Jews. This demonization and defamation can only be challenged properly by providing a historical context to what happened on the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel on the 7th of October 2023. Moreover, the historical context allows us to understand what unfolded after, both the genocidal Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip and the international reaction to it. Thus, knowing the historical context is crucial for understanding better what occurs in front of our eyes and even prepares us for what can develop later in the future. This is particularly true if we are not only curious about what happens in West Asia or in Palestine, but we care about what happened there. We're not just interested in what happened there, we are moved by what happens there. In particularly if we want to show solidarity with the victims of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and oppression, which are unfortunately our organic and integral part of the history of the Palestinians in their own homeland. So which junctures in history of Israel and Palestine are the formative moments in the past? We should familiarize ourselves with them in order to acquire the necessary knowledge that will help us to understand better the reality and, even more importantly, helps us to do our share to change that reality. The first junctures are 2 years, 1915 to 1970, 2 years in which a relative eccentric and marginal idea became a project of colonization due to imperial British greed. Up to 1915, a coalition of evangelical Christians, Jewish intellectuals, and anti-Semitic Western politicians proposed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine as the best solution for the problem of anti-Semitism, or as some members of this coalition saw it, as a solution for the inability of Central and Eastern Europe to accept the Jews as Europeans. As long as there was no powerful empire behind that coalition, all it produced was a movement of small numbers of European Jews who bought land in Palestine and built few settlements in it between the years 1882 and 1915. But it was clear that as long as Palestine remained part of the Ottoman Empire, as it had been for 400 years, these colonies did not pose an existential danger for the indigenous people of Palestine. But a very effective lobby exploited the growing imperial greed among British politicians and persuaded the British government to turn the issue of occupying Palestine and building a Jewish state there into a crucial item on the list of Britain's war aims during the Great War, the First World War. Although the Palestinians were 90% of the population, the moment their homeland fell under British rule and remained so for 30 years between 1918 and 1948, Britain had the power to facilitate the building of the infrastructure for a future Jewish state that was only possible through the dispossession of the Palestinians. Britain was not alone. West Europe, later the United States, Canada and Australia, as well as apartheid South Africa, lended their support to the project, being fully aware of the consequences for the local Palestinian people. The West was complicit in conceiving the project of settler colonial Zionism and for providing the necessary scaffolding for its early success. Hence the reluctance today in the West to face the more long-lasting consequences of this project, namely the genocide in Gaza. The next relevant juncture is 1948, the year the Palestinians called the Nakba, the catastrophe. With the state within a state, the Zionist movement built with the British help in between 1918 and 1948, which included the development of an army, it was possible for the settler colonial movement of Zionism to exploit the end of the British rule and the genocide of the Jews in Europe during the Second World War for planning and executing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine without fear of any Western condemnation. The attempt to eliminate the Palestinians in the year of 1948 was only partly successful. It did allow the Zionist movement to take over nearly 80% of historical Palestine, to destroy half of Palestine's villages and towns, and expel half of Palestine's Arab population. But it still left within the borders of historical Palestine a large number of Palestinians, and on Palestine's border, a huge refugee community built after the initial trauma in anti-colonial national movements fighting for liberation and for the return of the refugees who had been expelled in 1948. The relevance of the incompletion of the 1948 ethnic cleansing, on the one hand, and the Western license to execute it, on the other, persuaded subsequent Israeli governments that the job, so to speak, will be completed in the future with similar means. Namely, there was a need to occupy the 20% of historical Palestinians that had not yet been part of Israel in 1948, and to continue the ethnic cleansing of the population until Palestine would be with as few Palestinians as possible. The history of the Israeli oppression in the next decades, the imposition of military rule on the Palestinian minority that remained inside Israel until 1966, the imposition of that rule on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip since 1967, the incremental ethnic cleansing of the occupied Palestinians since 1967, the mass arrests without trial, the expropriation of land, the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank, the attempt to make Greater Jerusalem, the Galilee, and the Nakab exclusive Jewish spaces. All these actions, and including finally the inhuman siege on the Gaza Strip, are all part of the wish to complete the incompletion of 1948. The indifference of the West to these actions continued throughout all these decades and persuaded Israel that there are no limits or legal or moral inhibitions in continuing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. 1948 is also relevant because as part of the ethnic cleansing, Israel created the Gaza Strip. There was no Gaza Strip before 1948. Gaza City was the capital of a district that extended in the past over most of central and southern Palestine. In 1948, it was replaced by a rectangular strip Israel created as a receptor for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees who were expelled from the center and south of Palestine. These refugees could not cross the border into Egypt and thus were cramped in what became the largest refugee camp in the world. 70% of the people of Gaza are descendants of these refugees. Many of them came from the villages on whose ruins and lands the Jewish settlements that were attacked on the 7th of October 2023 were built. In 2018, these young descendants marched peacefully to demand return and were shot at. In 2023, they attempted more desperate means to achieve the same goal. The next junctures include escalation since 1967 in the oppression of the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This allowing millions of people any form of normal life, subjecting the people living there to the mercy of the Israeli army and the secret services. It is not the only place in the world that such inhumanity exists, but it is the only place the West denies that this inhumanity is a daily experience funded and immunized by the West. The Palestinians were patient and waited for 19 years of occupation before first attempting to resist it with a non-violent uprising in 1987, which it seemed for a moment produced an opportunity to end the oppression by diplomacy, only to learn that the West was a dishonest broker and used the diplomacy to allow further oppression. The next uprising in 2000, therefore, was more violent and provided a pretext for the colonizer and occupier to escalate further its ruthless oppression of the people. One of the major methods was mass arrests without trial, which the West condoned, although, like so many other Israeli actions, was a stark violation of international law. Taking hostages, deemed by the Palestinian guerrillas as the only way of releasing the thousands of political prisoners. This was the main motivation between the 7th of October 2023 operation, and in a way, while fully recognizing the incomprehensible price the people of Gaza paid for this success, it did lead to the release of thousands of Palestinians. This is not how it should be done, on every level. But to avoid it in the future, the West that created the problem in the first place should use the means in its possession to rectify the injustice by ending it through sanctions and pressure so that the oppression of the Palestinians would not continue, and would such a pressure would produce or would ignite the beginning of a process of decolonization that would benefit everyone who lives between the river Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, and all those who had been expelled from that homeland from 1948 until today. Thank you.